Sarah Martinez grew up in the dusty town of Bakersfield, California, where the summer heat could reach 110 degrees and opportunities for young women seemed as scarce as rain. Her father, Miguel, worked double shifts at the local oil refinery, while her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses for wealthy families on the other side of town. Sarah was the eldest of 4 children, and from an early age, she understood that responsibility meant everything. At age 12, Sarah discovered something that would change her life forever. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, took her hunting for the first time. He handed her an old rifle that had belonged to his father, a weapon that seemed too heavy for her small frame. But when Sarah looked through the scope and lined up her first shot at a target 200 yards away, something clicked. The bullet hit dead center. "Mija, you have a gift," her grandfather whispered, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he examined the target. "But gifts like this come with great responsibility." Throughout high school, Sarah spent every weekend at the shooting range. She worked part-time jobs to pay for ammunition and range fees, often arriving before dawn and staying until dusk. Her coaches noticed her exceptional ability, but Sarah had bigger dreams than local competitions. She wanted to serve her country, to make a difference in a world that seemed increasingly dangerous. The September 11th attacks happened during Sarah's senior year. She watched the towers fall on the television in her school's library, surrounded by classmates who were crying and confused. But Sarah felt something different that day, a burning determination that would define the rest of her life. She knew exactly what she needed to do. Against her parents' wishes, Sarah enlisted in the Army immediately after graduation. Her mother cried for 3 days straight, begging her to reconsider. Her father said nothing, but she caught him staring at her military recruitment papers with a mixture of pride and terror in his eyes. Basic training at Fort Benning was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The drill sergeants screamed at her, questioned her presence, and pushed her to physical limits she didn't know existed. Many of her fellow recruits were men who towered over her 5'6" frame, but Sarah refused to back down from any challenge. During weapons training, Sarah's exceptional marksmanship skills became immediately apparent. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 300 meters, Sarah was consistently hitting bullseyes at 600 meters with standard-issue equipment. Her drill sergeant, a gruff man named Sergeant Williams, who had served 3 tours in Iraq, pulled her aside one evening. "Martinez, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen natural shooting ability like yours," he said, his usually harsh voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Have you ever considered sniper school?" Sarah had heard whispers about sniper training, the grueling selection process, the months of intensive training, and the incredibly high washout rate. Most importantly, she knew that very few women had ever successfully completed the program. But the challenge excited rather than intimidated her. "What would it take, Sergeant?" she asked. "Everything you've got, and then some," he replied. "The physical demands are extreme, but the mental pressure is what breaks most people. You'll be alone out there, sometimes for days, with nothing but your thoughts and your mission. One mistake, one moment of doubt, and people die." Sarah spent the next 6 months preparing for sniper school selection. She ran 15 miles every morning before dawn, practiced shooting in all weather conditions, and studied military tactics until her eyes burned. She learned to control her breathing, her heartbeat, and most importantly, her mind. The night before she left for sniper school at Fort Benning's advanced training facility, Sarah called her grandfather. She could hear the pride in his voice, but also the worry of a man who understood what combat really meant. "Remember what I taught you, Mija," he said. "The rifle is just a tool. The real weapon is up here." He tapped his temple during their video call. "And yours is sharper than any blade." Sniper school was a different kind of hell. Of the 40 candidates who started the program, only 12 would graduate. Sarah was one of only 2 women in her class. The instructors pushed them through scenarios that tested not just their shooting ability, but their capacity to remain completely still for hours, their ability to calculate wind speed and bullet drop under pressure, and their mental fortitude when faced with life-or-death decisions. The stalking exercises were particularly brutal. Students had to crawl through various terrain types, sometimes covering only a few hundred meters in an entire day, all while remaining completely undetected by instructors with high-powered optics. Sarah's small frame, which had been a disadvantage in some physical training, became an asset here. She could squeeze into hiding spots that larger students couldn't access, but it was during the psychological evaluation portion that Sarah truly distinguished herself. The instructors presented scenarios where she would have to make split-second decisions about taking a life, situations where civilian casualties were possible, and moral dilemmas that had no clear right answer. Sarah's responses showed a maturity and clarity of thought that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. 3 months later, Sarah graduated third in her class, earning her the coveted sniper tab and the right to carry the designation expert marksman. But she knew that graduation was just the beginning. Real combat would test everything she had learned in ways that no training exercise ever could. Her first deployment came 8 months later. Sarah was assigned to a special operations unit operating in Afghanistan, in the mountainous region near the Pakistani border where Taliban fighters moved freely between villages and caves. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain that could tear equipment to shreds and weather that could change from blazing heat to freezing cold in a matter of hours. Sarah's team consisted of 12 soldiers, including her spotter, Corporal James "Jimmy" Rodriguez, a veteran of 2 previous deployments who had specifically requested to work with her after hearing about her training scores. Jimmy was from Texas, had 3 kids back home, and treated Sarah like the little sister he'd never had. "Listen, Martinez," he told her during their first mission briefing. "Out here, gender doesn't matter. Age doesn't matter. Nothing matters except whether you can do the job. From what I've heard, you can definitely do the job." Their unit's mission was to provide overwatch and reconnaissance for larger operations while eliminating high-value targets when the opportunity presented itself. Sarah would spend days at a time positioned on mountain ridges, scanning valleys below for enemy movement, reporting intelligence back to command, and occasionally taking shots that could change the entire course of an operation. The first time Sarah killed in combat, she was positioned on a ridge overlooking a village where intelligence indicated a Taliban commander was meeting with local sympathizers. She had been lying motionless in the same position for 14 hours, her ghillie suit covered in dust and debris, when she spotted movement in a compound below. Through her scope, she could see a man in traditional Afghan dress speaking with several others. Intel had confirmed this was Rashid Hassan, a Taliban leader responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The shot was 200 meters, with a crosswind that kept shifting direction. Sarah had to account for altitude, temperature, humidity, and the movement of her target. "Target confirmed," Jimmy whispered into his radio. "Wind is 3 to 5 knots, shifting east to west, range 200 meters. Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered what snipers call the zone, a state of complete focus where nothing exists except the rifle, the target, and the physics of the shot. She squeezed the trigger slowly, steadily, following through with the shot even as the rifle recoiled against her shoulder. The bullet traveled for nearly 2 seconds before finding its target. Through her scope, Sarah watched Rashid Hassan fall, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or excitement, but a profound sense of responsibility. She had just taken a life, ended someone's existence with a single decision and a precise movement of her finger. "Confirmed kill," Jimmy reported. "Target down." That night, back at base, Sarah sat alone outside her tent, staring up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the Afghan sky. She thought about Hassan's family, about the people who would mourn him. But she also thought about the coalition soldiers who would live because this particular enemy commander would never plan another attack. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. Gifts like this come with great responsibility. Sarah realized that night that being a sniper wasn't about being the best shot or having the steadiest hands. It was about carrying the weight of every decision, every trigger pull, every life taken in service of a larger mission. It was a burden that would follow her for the rest of her life, but it was also a calling that she finally understood she was meant to fulfill. Over the next several months, Sarah established herself as one of the most effective snipers in her unit. Her confirmed kill count reached 15, each one a carefully planned operation that eliminated threats to coalition forces. But more importantly, her reconnaissance work had provided intelligence that saved countless lives and led to the successful completion of dozens of missions. Word of her abilities began to spread beyond her immediate unit. Other special operations teams started requesting her specifically for high-risk operations. Sarah's reputation was built not just on her shooting ability, but on her professionalism, her calm under pressure, and her ability to make difficult decisions quickly and correctly. It was during this time that Sarah first heard about Admiral Marcus Thompson, a legendary Navy SEAL who had transitioned to overseeing special operations across multiple branches of the military. Thompson was known for his direct approach, his intolerance for incompetence, and his ability to identify soldiers who had the potential for the most challenging missions. Sarah didn't know it yet, but Admiral Thompson had already heard about her. He had read her after-action reports, studied her performance statistics, and spoken with her commanding officers. He was planning something special, a mission that would require not just exceptional shooting skills, but the kind of mental toughness that only a few people possessed. The message came on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah was cleaning her rifle when Sergeant Williams approached her with a folder marked Classified. "Martinez, you've got new orders," he said, his expression serious. "You're being transferred to a Joint Special Operations Task Force. They specifically requested you." Sarah opened the folder and read the brief summary. She would be joining a multinational team for an operation in a location that was redacted from her copy of the orders. What she could see was that this was considered one of the highest priority missions currently active, and that her role would be critical to its success. "When do I leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning." "And Martinez?" Sergeant Williams paused, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. "Whatever they're planning, they chose you for a reason. Don't let that responsibility weigh too heavily on your shoulders, but don't forget it either." That evening, Sarah called her family for the first time in 3 weeks. She couldn't tell them about her new assignment, but she wanted to hear their voices. Her mother still worried constantly. Her father still said little, but she could hear the pride in his silence. And her younger siblings were starting to understand that their big sister was doing something important, something dangerous, but something that mattered. As Sarah packed her gear that night, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From a 12-year-old girl holding her grandfather's rifle to a combat-proven sniper being selected for classified operations, every step had led to this moment. She didn't know what challenges awaited her, but she knew she was ready to face them. The next morning, as her transport helicopter lifted off from the forward operating base, Sarah watched the Afghan landscape disappear below her. She was heading toward a new chapter of her military career, one that would test everything she had learned and everything she believed about herself. In her pack, alongside her carefully maintained rifle and precision equipment, Sarah carried a small photo of her grandfather, taken during his Vietnam service. On the back, in his careful handwriting, were the words he had spoken to her all those years ago. "Gifts like this come with great responsibility." Sarah understood now that her gift wasn't just exceptional marksmanship. It was the ability to remain calm under pressure, to make difficult decisions quickly, and to carry the weight of those decisions without losing sight of the larger mission. These were the qualities that had brought her to the attention of Admiral Thompson. And these were the qualities that would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The helicopter touched down at a classified location somewhere in Eastern Europe. Sarah couldn't identify the exact country, but the cold, gray landscape and Soviet-era buildings suggested she was deep behind what had once been the Iron Curtain. Armed guards escorted her from the landing pad to a nondescript concrete building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. Inside, the facility was surprisingly modern. Advanced communications equipment lined the walls, and multiple large screens displayed satellite imagery and intelligence briefings. Sarah was directed to a conference room where she found herself face-to-face with some of the most elite soldiers she had ever encountered. There was Captain David Chen, a Marine Force recon sniper whose reputation preceded him. Sergeant First Class Maria Volkov, a former Russian Spetsnaz operator who had defected to the West 5 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Müller, a German KSK commando with expertise in urban warfare, and several others whose names she didn't recognize but whose bearing clearly marked them as special operations veterans. At the head of the table sat a man Sarah immediately knew must be Admiral Marcus Thompson. He was smaller than she had expected, maybe 5'8", with graying hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. His uniform bore the insignia of the Navy SEALs, along with ribbons indicating service in every major conflict of the past 20 years. "Sergeant Martinez," Admiral Thompson said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I've read your file. Impressive work in Afghanistan. But I need to know something before we proceed." He stood up and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. The room fell completely silent. Sarah could feel the eyes of every elite operator in the room focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to whatever test this was. "Why are you here?" Admiral Thompson asked, his voice quiet but somehow more intimidating than if he had been shouting. Sarah understood immediately that this wasn't a question about her travel arrangements or her assignment orders. This was a fundamental challenge to her presence among this elite group. Some of the most dangerous and capable soldiers in the world were watching to see if she belonged. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Sarah considered her response. She could talk about her training, her combat record, her marksmanship scores. She could mention the Taliban commanders she had eliminated or the intelligence she had gathered. But something told her that Admiral Thompson wasn't looking for a recitation of her achievements. Instead, Sarah remained silent. She met the Admiral's gaze directly, her expression calm and confident. She let her presence speak for itself. If her record and her selection for this mission weren't enough to justify her being here, then no words would convince him. Admiral Thompson stared at her for another long moment, then smiled slightly and returned to his seat. "Good," he said simply. "Now let's talk about why you're really here." The mission briefing that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever encountered. The target was Viktor Kozlov, a former Soviet nuclear engineer who had been selling weapons-grade uranium to terrorist organizations. Kozlov had evaded capture for 3 years, moving between safe houses in various Eastern European countries, always staying one step ahead of international law enforcement. Recent intelligence indicated that Kozlov was planning his biggest transaction yet, the sale of enough enriched uranium to create a small nuclear device. The meeting was set to take place in exactly 72 hours at a remote compound in the Carpathian Mountains. Multiple intelligence agencies had been tracking this operation for months, and this was likely their only chance to prevent a nuclear weapon from falling into terrorist hands. The compound was heavily fortified, surrounded by electronic security systems, and patrolled by Kozlov's well-armed mercenaries. A direct assault would be detected long before any team could reach the main building. Airstrikes were impossible due to the civilian population in nearby villages and the risk of dispersing radioactive material. That's where Sarah came in. There's a ridge approximately 2,800 meters northeast of the compound, Admiral Thompson explained, pointing to satellite imagery displayed on the wall screen. From that position, there's a clear line of sight to the main building's top floor, where we believe the meeting will take place. Sarah studied the images carefully. The ridge was well beyond the range of most small arms, but it was also exposed with very little cover. The shot would be at the absolute limit of her rifle's effective range, requiring perfect conditions and flawless execution. "What's my window?" Sarah asked. "Intelligence suggests the meeting will last approximately 2 hours," replied Captain Chen. "But Kozlov is paranoid. If anything seems out of place, he'll disappear again, and we may never get another chance." Admiral Thompson leaned forward. "This isn't just about eliminating one target, Sergeant Martinez. Our intelligence indicates there will be 3 individuals in that room: Kozlov, his buyer, and a middleman who's been coordinating these transactions. If we can eliminate all 3 simultaneously, we can disrupt this entire network." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. 3 targets, 2,800 meters, probably moving around the room, with a window of opportunity measured in seconds rather than minutes. It was a shot sequence that would challenge even the most experienced sniper, and failure would mean a nuclear weapon in the hands of terrorists. "I'll need my regular spotter," Sarah said. Admiral Thompson shook his head. "Corporal Rodriguez is currently deployed elsewhere. You'll be working with Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a Navy SEAL sniper who's been tracking Kozlov for the past 6 months. Lieutenant Kim stood up from where she had been sitting silently at the far end of the table. She was Korean-American, probably in her early 30s, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who had spent years in special operations. Sarah could tell immediately that Kim was evaluating her just as critically as Admiral Thompson had. "I've seen your service record," Kim said, her voice professional but not unfriendly. "Impressive work in Afghanistan, but this is different. We're not talking about Taliban fighters in open terrain. This is precision work under perfect surveillance conditions with zero margin for error." Sarah met Kim's gaze steadily. "I understand the stakes." "Do you?" Admiral Thompson interjected. "Because if you miss, if anything goes wrong, Kozlov will disappear forever. The uranium will be sold to people who want to detonate it in Washington or London or Paris. Thousands of innocent people will die because of one missed shot." The weight of what he was saying settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of responsibility that she had first experienced during her early combat deployments, but magnified beyond anything she had ever felt before. This wasn't just about eliminating enemy combatants or protecting her fellow soldiers. This was about preventing a nuclear terrorism attack. "I need to see the rifle," Sarah said. Lieutenant Kim led her to an adjacent room where Sarah's equipment had been laid out on a table, but instead of her familiar M24 sniper weapon system, she found herself looking at something she had only heard about in whispered conversations among snipers. "Barrett M107, Kim explained. 50 caliber semi-automatic, effective range out to 2,000 meters for most shooters, but we've had it specially modified for this mission." Sarah ran her hands over the massive rifle. At nearly 30 pounds, it was much heavier than her usual weapon, but she could feel the precision engineering in every component. The scope was unlike anything she had ever used, with range-finding capabilities and ballistic computers that could calculate bullet drop and wind drift automatically. "The ammunition is also special," Kim continued, opening a case containing rounds that looked like small missiles. "Armor-piercing with a tungsten core. They'll punch through the reinforced glass in that building like it's paper." Sarah picked up one of the massive rounds, feeling its weight and examining its construction. These weren't the precise, carefully balanced rounds she was used to. These were designed for maximum impact and penetration, but they would behave differently in flight than anything she had ever fired. "How much practice time do I have?" Sarah asked. 6 hours, Admiral Thompson said from the doorway. There's a range set up to approximate the distance and conditions you'll face. But understand, Martinez, we can't perfectly replicate the wind conditions in the mountains, and we can't simulate the pressure of knowing that failure means nuclear terrorism. For the next 6 hours, Sarah did nothing but shoot. She fired the M107 from every conceivable position, in various wind conditions, at targets placed at distances ranging from 2,500 to 3,000 meters. The rifle was incredibly powerful, but required a completely different shooting technique than anything she was accustomed to. The recoil was massive, even with the rifle's advanced muzzle brake system. After the first few shots, Sarah's shoulder was already bruised, and her ears were ringing despite her hearing protection. But gradually, she began to understand the weapon's characteristics, how it responded to different wind conditions, and how to compensate for the unique ballistic properties of the heavy ammunition. Lieutenant Kim proved to be an exceptional spotter, with an intuitive understanding of wind patterns and ballistic calculations. But Sarah could sense that Kim was still evaluating her, still questioning whether she was really capable of making this shot when everything was on the line. "Your technique is solid," Kim admitted after Sarah had put 5 consecutive rounds into a 6-inch circle at 2,800 meters. "But technique isn't everything. When we're out there, when you're looking through that scope at real targets, when you know that missing means nuclear weapons in terrorist hands, it's going to feel different." Sarah understood what Kim was getting at, but she also knew something that Kim didn't. She had felt that weight before, on a smaller scale, but with the same fundamental understanding of responsibility. Every shot she had taken in Afghanistan had carried the weight of life and death, had meant the difference between mission success and failure, between fellow soldiers coming home or not coming home. "I've been carrying that weight for 2 years, Sarah replied quietly. "It doesn't get lighter, but you learn to carry it." The night before the mission, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She lay in her narrow bunk, running through the shot sequence over and over in her mind. 3 targets moving independently, approximately 2,800 meters away, through reinforced glass, with wind conditions that would be constantly changing. She thought about her grandfather, about the first time he had put a rifle in her hands and told her about responsibility. She thought about Sergeant Williams, who had first suggested sniper school and had watched her develop into the soldier she was today. She thought about Jimmy Rodriguez, her spotter in Afghanistan, and how he would react when he found out she had taken on a mission of this magnitude without him. Most of all, she thought about the thousands of innocent people who might die if she failed. Children in schools, families in their homes, people going about their daily lives who had no idea that their survival might depend on one soldier's ability to make an impossible shot under perfect conditions. At 0500 hours, Sarah and Lieutenant Kim were awakened and briefed on the final intelligence. Satellite surveillance confirmed that Kozlov had arrived at the compound and that the meeting was scheduled for 1400 hours local time. Weather reports indicated partly cloudy skies, with winds from the southwest at 5 to 10 knots, with gusts up to 15 knots. By 0800, Sarah and Kim were in a helicopter heading toward their insertion point. They would be dropped approximately 15 kilometers from their shooting position and would have to hike through rough terrain while carrying the massive M107 rifle and all their supporting equipment. The hike was brutal. The M107, even broken down into components, was incredibly heavy. Sarah's pack weighed more than 80 pounds, and the terrain was steep and rocky. But she had trained for this, had pushed her body to its limits and then beyond. Kim set a punishing pace, testing Sarah's endurance and determination right up until the moment they would have to perform. They reached their position at 11:30 hours, giving them 2.5 hours to set up and wait for the meeting to begin. The ridge was exactly as the satellite imagery had suggested, exposed, rocky, with minimal cover. Sarah and Kim would be completely vulnerable if they were detected, but the distance and elevation should make that unlikely. Sarah assembled the M107 with practiced efficiency while Kim set up her spotting scope and range-finding equipment. The distance to the compound measured exactly 2,847 meters, and the wind was holding steady from the southwest at approximately 8 knots. Conditions were as good as they could hope for. Through her scope, Sarah could see the compound clearly. It was a 3-story stone building surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, and she could see electronic sensors and cameras mounted at regular intervals. A direct assault on this facility would have been suicide for any conventional force. At 13:45, Kim spotted movement in the compound's courtyard. 3 vehicles approaching, she reported quietly into her radio. Black SUVs, heavily armored. Sarah adjusted her scope and watched as the vehicles entered the compound. Men emerged from the SUVs. She counted 12 total, all armed with automatic weapons. Among them was a man in an expensive suit who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "That's Kozlov," Kim confirmed, consulting photos from their briefing materials. "Gray hair, dark coat. He's moving toward the main building." Sarah tracked Kozlov through her scope as he entered the building. According to their intelligence, the meeting would take place in a conference room on the top floor. Sarah adjusted her aim to the windows of that floor and waited. At exactly 1400 hours, figures appeared in the conference room windows. Sarah could see 3 men clearly. Kozlov, a younger man in traditional Middle Eastern dress, who was presumably the buyer, and an older man, who must be the middleman who had arranged the transaction. "Range 2,847 meters, Kim whispered. "Wind holding at 8 knots southwest. Temperature 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 45%. Sarah made final adjustments to her scope, accounting for all the environmental factors that would affect her shot. At this distance, she would have to aim nearly 20 feet above her target to account for bullet drop, and the wind drift would move her shots several feet to the left. "Target 1 is Kozlov, gray suit, standing by the window," Kim continued her spotting report. "Target 2 is the buyer, dark suit, seated at the table. Target 3 is the middleman, brown jacket, pacing near the back wall." Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow as she entered the focused state that had served her so well in Afghanistan. But this was different. The distance was far greater than any shot she had attempted in combat. The targets were moving, and the consequences of failure were almost unimaginable. "Wind's picking up," Kim reported, "gusting to 12 knots. Sarah waited, watching the wind patterns through her scope, looking for a moment when conditions would be optimal. She had 3 targets to engage in rapid succession, and she would only get one opportunity. If she missed the first shot, or if her targets realized what was happening and took cover, the mission would fail. Through her scope, she watched Kozlov approach the window, gesturing toward something outside. The buyer rose from his seat and joined Kozlov at the window. The middleman continued pacing, but his pattern brought him near the window every 30 seconds. "Wind dropping," Kim whispered. "Steady at 6 knots. Sarah centered her crosshairs on Kozlov's chest, accounting for bullet drop and wind drift. At 2,847 meters, the bullet would take approximately 4 seconds to reach its target. She would have to track her target's movement and predict where they would be when the bullet arrived. The middleman's pacing brought him to the window area. For just a moment, all 3 targets were within a 6-foot area near the conference room windows. Sarah knew this was her opportunity. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil from the M107 was tremendous, even though Sarah had braced herself properly. The massive rifle bucked against her shoulder with enough force to slide her entire body backward several inches across the rocky ground. For a moment, the scope was knocked completely off target, and Sarah had to quickly reacquire her view of the compound. Through the scope, she watched the .50 caliber round travel across the valley toward its target. At this distance, she could actually see the bullet's vapor trail as it cut through the afternoon air. The physics of the shot were perfect. Her calculations for bullet drop, wind drift, and target movement had been precise. The bullet struck Kozlov in the center of his chest with devastating effect. The impact threw him backward into the conference room, and Sarah could see the massive exit wound as the tungsten core round continued through his body and into the wall behind him. But there was no time to observe the results of her first shot. The other two targets were already reacting to the sound of the window exploding inward. Sarah worked the M107's semi-automatic action as quickly as possible, ejecting the spent brass and chambering a fresh round. The buyer was diving toward the floor, but his movement was predictable, and Sarah tracked him smoothly through her scope. Her second shot caught him as he tried to take cover behind the conference table. The .50 caliber round punched through the heavy wooden table as if it were cardboard and found its target. The middleman was running toward the conference room door, but the room wasn't large enough for him to escape Sarah's field of view. Her third shot, fired less than 8 seconds after her first, struck him in the back as he reached for the door handle. The massive round's impact threw him forward into the door, which splintered under the combined force of his body and the bullet's remaining energy. "All targets down," Kim reported into her radio, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Kozlov confirmed KIA. Buyer confirmed KIA. Middleman confirmed KIA. Mission accomplished. Sarah continued to observe the compound through her scope, watching for any signs of response from Kozlov's security team. But the distance had been so great that the sound of her shots wouldn't reach the compound for several more seconds, and even then, the guards wouldn't immediately understand what had happened. "Movement in the courtyard," Sarah reported. "Guards responding to the sound of breaking glass, but they don't seem to understand what happened." Through her scope, Sarah watched the confusion below as armed men rushed into the main building. Some were pointing toward the conference room, others were scanning the surrounding hills, but none of them were looking in her direction. The distance that had made her shot so difficult was now protecting her from immediate discovery. "Time to go," Kim said, already beginning to break down her spotting equipment. "Satellite intel shows government forces converging on this area. We need to be at the extraction point in 90 minutes. Sarah carefully disassembled the M107, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. As she secured the components in her pack, she realized that her entire body was trembling slightly, not from fear or excitement, but from the sheer physical impact of firing 3 .50 caliber rounds in rapid succession. The hike to their extraction point was even more difficult than their approach had been. Sarah's shoulder throbbed from the rifle's recoil, and the weight of their equipment seemed to have doubled. But more than the physical discomfort, she was processing the magnitude of what had just happened. She had just prevented a nuclear weapon from falling into terrorist hands with 3 shots fired across nearly 3 kilometers. The precision required, the pressure of the situation, and the consequences of success or failure were unlike anything she had ever experienced. And she had succeeded. As they reached the extraction point, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching in the distance. Soon she would be debriefed, her mission would be classified at the highest levels, and she would return to regular duty as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something inside her had changed during those few seconds on the mountain ridge. The helicopter ride back to base was conducted in complete silence. Sarah stared out the window at the Eastern European landscape below, thinking about the 3 men whose lives she had ended with precision shots across an impossible distance. She felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had accompanied every combat action she had ever taken, but magnified to a degree she hadn't known was possible. Lieutenant Kim finally spoke as their helicopter began its approach to the landing zone. "I've worked with some of the best snipers in the world," she said, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's engines. "I've never seen shooting like that. 3 targets, that distance, moving through glass, in less than 8 seconds. It was perfect." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't reply. She understood that what she had accomplished was exceptional, but she also understood that recognition wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that a nuclear weapon would not be detonated in a major city, that thousands of innocent lives had been saved, and that a network of weapons dealers had been disrupted. Back at the classified facility, Sarah was immediately taken to a debriefing room where Admiral Thompson and several other officers she didn't recognize were waiting. They questioned her about every aspect of the mission: her shot preparation, her environmental calculations, her target identification, and her execution of the shot sequence. "Sergeant Martinez," Admiral Thompson said when the formal debriefing was complete, "what you accomplished today will never be officially acknowledged. There will be no medals, no commendations, no public recognition. This mission never happened, and these shots were never fired." Sarah understood. Special operations often required soldiers to perform extraordinary actions that could never be publicly acknowledged. The nature of their work demanded secrecy, and the satisfaction of mission accomplishment had to be its own reward. "However," Admiral Thompson continued, "I want you to understand the significance of what you did. Our intelligence estimates indicate that the uranium Kozlov was selling could have been used to create a device capable of killing 50,000 people or more. Your actions today saved those lives." The Admiral paused, studying Sarah with the same intense evaluation she had experienced during their first meeting. "I'm also authorized to offer you a permanent position with this task force," he said. "The work would be similar to what you did today. High-priority targets, impossible conditions, missions where failure is not an option. Are you interested?" Sarah considered the offer carefully. Joining this elite unit would mean more missions like today's, extraordinary challenges that would test every skill she possessed, life-or-death situations where the stakes were measured not in military objectives, but in civilian casualties. It would also mean years of classified work, missions she could never discuss with her family, and a level of responsibility that most soldiers never experienced. But it would also mean using her unique abilities to protect innocent people in ways that regular military service couldn't accomplish. The shot she had just made proved that she was capable of operating at this level, and she knew that there were other Victor Kozlovs in the world, other threats that required this kind of precision intervention. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I'm interested." Admiral Thompson smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. "Good. Report to Lieutenant Kim for assignment briefing tomorrow at 800. And Martinez?" He stood up, extending his hand toward her. "Welcome to the most elite unit in the United States military. What you did today was extraordinary, but it's just the beginning." That evening, Sarah called her grandfather from a secure phone in her temporary quarters. She couldn't tell him about the mission, couldn't describe the shots she had made or the lives she had saved. But she wanted to hear his voice, to connect with the man who had first recognized her gift and taught her about the responsibility that came with it. "Mija, you sound different," her grandfather said after they had talked for a few minutes about family and home. "Something important happened today." Sarah wasn't surprised that he could sense the change in her voice. Her grandfather had always been able to read her moods and emotions, even across thousands of miles. "I can't talk about it, abuelo," she said. "But I want you to know that everything you taught me, everything you said about responsibility and gifts and using them properly, it all mattered today." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When her grandfather spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I am proud of you, Mija. Whatever you did, wherever you are, I am proud of the woman you have become and the soldier you are." After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat alone in her room, thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. From a 12-year-old girl in Bakersfield holding her grandfather's rifle to an elite special operations sniper preventing nuclear terrorism with precision shots across impossible distances, every step had prepared her for this day. She thought about Admiral Thompson's question. Why are you here? She understood now that her silence had been the correct answer, because her presence, her actions, and her results had answered the question more effectively than any words could have. She was there because she possessed a unique combination of skills, mental toughness, and dedication that made her capable of missions that others couldn't accomplish. The next morning, Sarah reported to Lieutenant Kim as instructed. She found Kim in the same briefing room where she had first met Admiral Thompson, but now the room was set up with detailed maps of various global locations and intelligence briefings on multiple high-priority targets. "Welcome to the team," Kim said, gesturing toward a chair at the briefing table. "I hope you got some sleep because we have another situation developing that's going to require our attention." Sarah sat down and opened the briefing folder Kim handed her. Inside were satellite photos of a compound in Somalia, intelligence reports on a suspected chemical weapons facility, and preliminary plans for a reconnaissance mission that would require long-range shooting capabilities. "The timeline is compressed on this one," Kim explained. "We deploy in 72 hours. The shot distances will be similar to what you handled yesterday, but the environmental conditions will be much more challenging. Desert heat, shifting winds, and multiple moving targets." Sarah studied the materials carefully, already beginning to calculate the challenges she would face. But she felt ready. The shot she had made at 247 meters had proven to herself and to others that she could operate at this level. She had found her calling, her purpose, and her place in the military hierarchy. "One more thing," Kim added, closing her own briefing folder. "Admiral Thompson wanted me to give you this." She handed Sarah a small wooden box. Inside, Sarah found a brass cartridge case, the spent brass from her first shot at Viktor Kozlov. Engraved on the side was the date of the mission and the distance, 2847 Meru. "He said to tell you that every sniper should remember their most important shot," Kim explained. "That one saved a lot of lives." Sarah held the brass case, feeling its weight and thinking about the moment it had been fired. In a few seconds of precise shooting, she had prevented a nuclear attack, saved thousands of lives, and earned her place among the most elite soldiers in the world. As she prepared for her next mission, Sarah understood that Admiral Thompson's question would follow her throughout her career. "Why are you here?" The answer would continue to be demonstrated through her actions, her precision, and her unwavering commitment to protecting innocent lives through the application of extraordinary skills under impossible conditions. She was there because some missions required the absolute best, because some threats could only be eliminated through perfect execution under perfect pressure, and because she had proven herself capable of carrying that responsibility. The brass cartridge case would remain with her throughout her career, a reminder of the day she had answered Admiral Thompson's question not with words, but with a 2,800-meter shot that prevented nuclear terrorism and established her as one of the most lethal and precise snipers in military history. Years later, when other soldiers asked Sarah about her service with the elite task force, when they wondered how she had earned the respect of legends like Admiral Thompson, when they questioned whether she belonged among the most dangerous operators in the world, she would simply display the brass case with its engraved distance marker. The shot spoke for itself. The precision, the pressure, the consequences, and the success all combined to answer every question about her capabilities and her place in the military hierarchy. She was there because when lives hung in the balance and failure was not an option, she could make the impossible shot. And that was all the answer anyone ever needed.